or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from. This is Michael Cross with another episode of Unlock the Door Radio, where we're not afraid to challenge the prevailing norms and paradigms of society and follow those great words of admonition from Benjamin Franklin. Those were to question authority at all times. Now, speaking of questioning authority, I'd like tonight to deal with the topic of psychopaths and sociopaths. Now, we've dealt with this before. We've interviewed quite a few people, quite a few experts, but tonight we are privileged to have back with us Emmy Thomas, who is the author of Life Through the Eyes of a Female Sociopath. Hello.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I'm sorry. The title, and this is just to clarify if people care, is Confessions of a Sociopath, a Life Spent Hiding in Plain Sight.
Ah, okay. So anyone wants to find that, they can click on the link or just go to those words instead. Sorry about that.
No problem. The title kept changing. I should have changed it to that title. What was your title? Your title sounded better.
Oh, I think I accidentally read it off from the old YouTube. It was the Life Through the Eyes of a Female Sociopath. So I accidentally read that.
I like that. No, that has a good ring to it.
Yeah.
We should title this episode of the radio show that maybe.
Yeah. Well, that's where if you looked it up on YouTube, that's our interview we did last year.
Excellent.
Hey, now, what I would like to do tonight is instead of talking so much about politics, instead of talking about those kinds of the checklist and so forth of sociopathy, what I'd like to deal with tonight is more relationship oriented. Love, sex, marriage, friendship when it comes to people who are psychopathic and sociopathic. And you seem to have a different perspective. I'm reading through your website, Sociopathic World, for our guests out there that want to check it out. And in the area where you're talking about love, for instance, you say a lot of profound things about how a sociopath or psychopath sees the world, especially a woman. Tell us that you have a diagnosis.
Yeah, I do. I have been diagnosed.
Okay, so give me your perspective when it comes to, for instance, what is the difference between a regular person and a psychopath when it comes to a relationship situation?
I think a lot of the differences are sort of the default beliefs and values that the sociopath has. Everybody kind of grows up, and I don't know if it's from watching romantic comedies or if it's from watching your own parents, if your parents were still married and interacting, or, watching a parent with another romantic interest. I'm not sure how it is that we come to conceive of our idea of what is a relationship, but I feel like there is a strong socializing that happens. I don't think that we are just born with the idea that men should do this in the relationship and women should do this, or that in other types of relationships that there's somebody who's dominant, or power struggles are always in relationships, or they're never in relationships, or healthy relationships. You can never have a situation in which somebody resents another, or resentment is just natural and normal and we shouldn't try to stifle that. Everybody has these beliefs. And I feel like the main thing about a sociopath is the sociopath does not have those default beliefs. So you come into a relationship thinking, I deserve X, Y, and Z to be treated these ways. And the things that I don't want to experience in a relationship are A, B, C. And you have such strong feelings about those that if somebody violates those rules that you have for relationships and does A, B, C, or fails to do X, Y, and Z, then that person has betrayed you, betrayed your trust maybe. They have been disloyal, you think. They have been, maybe you start thinking, what is the whole relationship built on? This person must have been acting opportunistically the whole time, tricking me into falling in love with them, tricking me into dating them or pursuing a relationship with them. And I think that's how people often feel when they are in relationships with sociopaths, and sort of the first month or two maybe is bliss. The sociopath is on his best behavior, his or her best behavior, I should say, and is trying to be the perfect mate, is trying to accommodate the other person, is being seductive, is being charming. And then, as things progress, the sociopath sort of stops doing that a little bit because they want to let down the mask, I think, a little bit. They don't want to feel like it's a constant performance for them. Because if they come home and have to perform and they're at work and they have to perform and they're always wearing a mask, it's exhausting. So they're not going to keep that up indefinitely in most relationships, unless it's a situation like, and this happens with normal people too, maybe a Barbie type girl is married to old billionaire, and she's going to constantly kind of keep up this uh, projected image that she loves him, when she doesn't. And, will have sex with him 2.5 times a week or whatever that she's kind of imagined. So I guess a lot of people do have marriages in which they perform constantly for each other. Sociopath is probably not very interested in that unless the other person is performing back. Is the other person performing or otherwise providing for them monetarily or with opportunities, professional opportunities, or otherwise in a way that makes it worth it for the sociopath to keep up sort of his end of the bargain. And that's how a sociopath typically sees a relationship, is that it is this bargain.
Okay. Well, I find that I just do fiction, and I have these books where the female hero is a psychopath. The Freedom from Conscience series. There's 3 books out so far, 4th one coming out soon. The thing is that a lot of people will say when they're giving me feedback that they don't understand their own selves because they feel like they fall in love with the character, the female character, and that makes them feel troubled because they see that this person is more childlike in their fixation on somebody and ultimately trying to fulfill certain expectations in their life. Now, is it possible, because in my books the main character does have rather unconventional relationships but very long-term relationships at the same time, is it unusual for someone who's psychopathic to have loyalty and connection to someone for the long term?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it, actually, is that the sociopath's relationships and approaches to relationships are a little bit childlike. That's what I mean, sort of like a bargain. You see little children with their parents, and the parent denies them something like, no, you can't go outside and play now. It's too late or something. I hate you, mom, is what they say, because the child does sort of see the relationship as a bargain. The mom behaves a particular way, does particular things for him, and in response, he gives her like love and affection. And I do think there's something a little bit, well, definitely manipulative about it, but there's also something kind of innocent. We don't necessarily think of children as being evil because they have that conception of a relationship that's built on it being a bargain. We just think they don't really have the emotional capacity to have something more than that, something that's built more on an unconditional love. But I think, look at children. Children have very long-lasting relationships. They actually do love their parents in a way. They do love their siblings in a way. They have feelings of affection for them. They have feelings of care. And similarly, I think that sociopaths can also have those type of relationships, either friendship or romantic relationships or in their family.
Okay. Now, to get into some of the specifics here, which I'm sure my audience will appreciate, I've heard a lot of people say that when they get involved with someone who's psychopathic, that it's like a thrill ride, that all of a sudden their life is expanded greatly. It's like an adrenaline rush in which everything, relationship-wise, sexual-wise, and so forth, to the psychopath is an adventure because they need constant stimulation. They need novelty. Is that generally the case with, psychopaths in general and women in general who are psychopathic?
That's a very interesting observation that people have made, and I do think that it's true, and I think it comes from two aspects. You kind of hit a little bit on both. I think it helps to clarify just slightly what the two are. One, a sociopath is very different from any other person that you've dated. And some of those differences people really dislike, right? We've kind of talked a little bit about some of those differences. And some of those differences are very enjoyable. They are thrilling. It's exciting. The sociopath lives in a different world and is free from things, constraints like guilt or shame. They don't have self-esteem problems. You can kind of imagine what a relief it might be like to be with somebody who does not constantly need affirmation about who they are, who is like 100% comfortable in their skin. How might that look in terms of being in a romantic relationship? They're just utterly confident and willing to both take the lead and not take the lead, and really flexible. People say that sex with a sociopath is pretty amazing, is kind of another stereotype about sociopaths, and you can imagine why that would be, this utter feeling of confidence that they have. I think the other aspect is that, yeah, sociopaths engage in kind of thrill-seeking behaviors. They like to have things be exciting. So if you're involved with a sociopath, then you are also kind of engaging in those particular activities, things that you might have been afraid to do by yourself, or things that you wouldn't have necessarily even considered to do by yourself without being prompted by the sociopath. There's an interesting quote. It's the featured comment on my website. Kind of talks a little bit about this. It says, "My angle is that they are less frightening if you take the time to understand them and don't get freaked out by the fact that they cannot reciprocate feelings the way normal people are used to. They reciprocate using their intellect and on their own time. They can bring a new perspective, new energy, even a new lifetime, as you call it, without necessarily changing who you are at your core, if you take the time to tame them and be tamed by them, since they will invariably pick you, not the other way around."
Mm-hmm. So essentially, with them, the avenues that they see when it comes to sexuality is more of a let's explore all aspects versus, okay, this is the way I was raised, and here's the things that are right and wrong and so forth.
Right. We were talking earlier about these default beliefs that we grow up with from romantic comedies or something, how sociopaths don't have those default beliefs. And so you can imagine, the sorts of things that would make somebody else ashamed for some reason. They think is like deviant, or they think is not normal or typical, or things like that. Even the idea of like making love, sociopaths, I do not think make love the way that most people sort of conceive of that. And that, that not having that emotional intimacy in a sexual experience is, it could be a bad thing. You may get sick of that it's not emotionally intimate enough for you. And if that's something that you kind of crave, then, that is definitely something that you would miss. But there is also sort of a thrill and a physicality to not having that constraint, to not being constantly concerned about the emotional intimacy and the vulnerability of the other person. It is more of a physical act. It's more of a pursuit of pleasure.
Okay, but it could take an intellectual side as well. I'm thinking of someone such as Aleister Crowley. I often think that he must have been what's known as a cerebral psychopath, but he seemed to take an intellectual pleasure connected to his physical pleasure.
I'm not familiar with Aleister Crowley.
Okay, yeah, but kind of like some of the cult leaders who might connect an act of sexuality not so much on the emotional level, but as an intellectual, spiritual, physical level with someone.
Right, and this is kind of an interesting aspect of sociopathy too in relationships. I think that I use the word seduction in a way that most people do not use seduction. I use seduction. Most people, I think of seduction and they think of somebody's trying to get you into bed. Somebody is trying to, that's their whole purpose, is it's completely about sex, and that's all it's physical. But I don't use seduction that way at all. I always think of it in terms of you are entering into somebody's mind in a way that is going to permanently alter the way that they view the world, experience the world after you. You're making this indelible mark on who they are as a person. That is kind of the goal. Sex is just a tool to get to that point. What I'm really worried about, or not worried about, seeking, is winning people's souls and minds, not just their bodies.
Okay, so it's more of a possession.
Yeah, it is. It's a possession. It's a little bit of a power thing. It's a little bit of a control thing, but it's seeing it's a little bit like art. You create something. You have created this thing in this person's mind now. They will forever associate certain things with you. They will forever be impacted by you. You have taken something that was, complete in its own way. Like I guess you could say paint is complete, but you've created something different, something new. You are a creator in that sense, not necessarily a destroyer always in relationships, although there is also beauty in destruction.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering now. That gets me. I know someone who, in her relationships, she speaks almost in that sense. I don't know if she's sociopathic or psychopathic, but she sees sexuality as something to open up to people. She takes pleasure in she's even said how many heterosexual women she's turned to at least bisexuality or lesbianism and that sort of thing. And it seems to give her a sense of accomplishment, and so forth. So this is kind of the thing. Opening people's minds to new vistas is something that's hardwired into people who are psychopathic or sociopathic.
I think, yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily that particular thing is hardwired, but it is very, very common. I think, this need for stimulation mixed with this desire for power. The primary motivation probably of a psychopath, sociopath is power. And what better, it's like architects who have a dream of creating something that will last for centuries, and is forever going to impact the environment around it. I think it's less of a sociopathic, solely a sociopathic inclination and more of a drive that is human nature, is to want to affect some sort of change, to tell the world essentially, I exist. I existed here, and here is the proof of it. It's very Ozymandias, here, look upon my works and tremble, sort of thing. And even though it seems a little bit ridiculous, we all know that, eventually all these things that we've created, a building an architect builds is going to crumble. Somebody who has been seduced is going to move on and be seduced by other people or seduce other people or be involved in other relationships. And we like to think that we're leaving indelible marks behind, but we know that's probably not true. It's a little bit egomaniacal and, seems to suggest that there are delusions of grandeur, to think of it that way. But, I think it's not just a sociopathic delusion, but a kind of a common delusion that we all want to make some sort of difference that we can see in the world around us.
Mm-hmm. We'll get to children in a little bit because it sounds a lot like when people want to leave a mark, they leave their children, their genetic legacy. But
right.
Real quick, now that I just want to follow up a little bit here. Would you say that male and female psychopaths have the same mindset, or does the male use a different form of conquest than the female does?
I think that there are definitely differences in the genders for male-female psychopaths. I think, you even think I have a transgendered friend, and he behaves really differently on the hormones that he's currently on than he ever acted before. He has sort of a different personality, at least a very different twist on his previous personality. So I do think that, you have your brain chemistry, but you also have hormones. That's a big deal. I also think the gender roles in our society influence heavily the ways that young sociopaths develop. Whether they like it or not, people believe that girls should behave one way and that boys should behave another way. And so consequently, there are going to be certain things that are easier for a girl to do, girl sociopath, that options that aren't really available to a boy sociopath, and vice versa. So I do think it really does change. And sociopaths generally like to kind of take the path of least resistance. So they're not likely to really buck against those trends as much as, at least eventually, just adopting them as their own and, realizing, okay, yeah, there are certain strengths and weaknesses to me being either male or female and being perceived that way in society. And I'm just going to capitalize on the strengths and try to minimize as much as possible the weaknesses.
Okay, so the female would be more likely to use sex as a weapon versus the male who might use domination in other ways.
Exactly. Yeah, domination, the expectations for a male to be powerful, to have money. He doesn't need to kind of use his body the same way, or sexuality the same way that a female sociopath would.
Mm-hmm. Oh, but before we go on from there, I just have to ask this question. Would you say it would be very unusual for either a male or female psychopath or sociopath to let themselves go? Wouldn't they be, because of their very makeup, more likely to take a strong interest in their appearance at whatever age?
Yeah, I think that kind of is true. I think that I have said before, I don't generally find sociopaths to be fat specifically. And I think often it's because you think about some people genetically are that way, but a lot of people, there is some influence of lifestyle and also their psychology, their emotional beliefs about food. It's comfort food. They get stressed. They eat food. Sociopaths aren't experiencing those same sorts of emotional stresses, and so they don't have to self-medicate in the same sorts of ways. So I also kind of think, maybe sociopaths aren't going to necessarily be the people at the gym spending 4 hours a day at the gym either, because they don't have the same sorts of insecurities that often plague those types of people. They feel fine in their body. They don't feel the need to constantly be manipulating it to be, even more muscular, even less body fat. So they tend to just be normal looking people, I think. Attractive because they are so confident. They exude confidence, and people find confidence to be attractive.
Okay, so they might have a running or biking program, but they're not going to be out there taking steroids.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to cover that there to a degree. Now, and which of course would be good in the sense of them being able to go out and be able to achieve their goals, since if they have the self-confidence as well as a good body image, then they're going to do quite well, I think, in today's society.
Right. And I think that the fact that when you associate people who have body issues, it tends to make you feel like you should also somehow be ashamed of your body. And so that's an anti-seduction trap to fall into, is you have issues about your body. Like I've heard a lot of people say this, especially women, but I think that men are starting to express this more, whether they feel it more or not, or whether they're just expressing it more, it's not clear. But this idea that they can't really give themselves over to sex completely, because there's always like this self-awareness of their body. They don't feel absolutely comfortable in their body. They have little pieces of shame about their body. They don't like the way that this looks, and they don't want to be in this sort of lighting or this sort of position because they feel like their body is something to be ashamed of. And I find that to be something that, sociopaths would like never even think of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, which of course would make them probably more dynamic when it comes to a relationship.
Exactly.
Now, I want to go back to one thing, and that was the idea that you said on your website. I'm probably paraphrasing here, but most people sink into routines and kind of pretend to live. Now, you said the sociopath might start getting a little bit towards the letting down their mask. But if they let down their mask and the person they're with doesn't mind the person they find themselves with, won't the won't the psychopath or sociopath, if they want the long-term relationship, probably be into doing things that will alleviate any kind of boredom? They're the ones who might want to travel the world and go to remote jungles and do adrenaline tourism and that sort of thing to keep things alive if they want the security of having a relationship with someone.
Yeah, let me clarify. You are saying, so in a relationship, somebody is dating a sociopath and they enjoy the fact that the person's a sociopath. They're fine with, pretty much all aspects of the sociopath, or they're willing to take the good with the bad sort of thing. And so the non-sociopath person in the relationship would try to promote more thrill seeking in order to keep the sociopath happy, or this, are you asking that the sociopath would be doing that thrill-seeking behavior and that would make the overall relationship more enriching?
Well, maybe both. Maybe the person who is not sociopathic is finding this enjoyable because I can't remember who it said. Again, I think it was Benjamin Franklin that said that most people die at 25, but they're not buried until they're 75.
Right.
And people find, I think, people sink into boredom and so forth, a conformity, you might say. I mean, I live in Sweden. That's like the most conformist society on earth. Don't believe any of the movies or anything like that. It is
Right.
very well, unless like Star Trek, the Borg without the attachments in their eyes or something. But it is much more conformistic, I think, than even Japan. And I'm just thinking that if a person winds up with someone who is a thrill seeker and they've grown up in conformity, there's some of them that'll feel threatened. They'll leave. They're like, oh my gosh, I can't take this. The other type, though, might feel like this is an eye-opening experience, and they also get the serotonin rush, the adrenaline, and so forth. And so even though they may be emotional, they are also enjoying the company of this male or female or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think that there are people who, I've heard this before. People say, now that I've dated a sociopath and broken up with a sociopath, I can't go back to normal life. I can't go back to a normal sort of bland relationship that's constrained by all of this socialization that via their relationship with a sociopath, they've learned these things aren't necessarily true about relationships. I don't have to feel shame about this. I don't have to feel like the relationship must include these aspects and cannot include any of these aspects. There's a lot of freedom and excitement in dating a sociopath. And I think that it does, like be racist possibly, but favorably sort of racist. That once you go black, you can never go back. I think there is like a little bit of that to about a sociopath. They do open those vistas, and once you do become aware of your mind is expanded and your worldview is expanded in those particular ways, it is difficult to go back to living a blander life. Not that all relationships without sociopaths obviously are bland, but you have different expectations and different things that you want in the world after that. And I think it's almost sad that there are people who are like that, who would enjoy and have meaningful relationships with sociopaths, and they're obviously sociopaths, and those people should be getting together, right? But what we often find is, as you said, there are other people who would be very upset by a relationship with a sociopath. They would want, the XYZ and not want the ABC. And to the extent that the sociopath violates it, then that's very upsetting to them. And those are the people who are on these forums in which they say they've been the victim of a sociopath. And it's like tragic. There should be some sort of dating website or something. If you want to date a sociopath, then get on the website. And if you're a sociopath and you want to date somebody, then you also get on the website. And only those people would be in relationships. And that would seem to work. But I think that the victims of the sociopaths, they have kind of an interesting attitude. It's not just like, not for me. Like escargot, for instance. Okay, if other people want to eat snails, then let them. but I don't personally want to. Maybe some people feel that way. Instead, they kind of think, it's wrong. Nobody should be eating snails. Like sociopaths are wrong and they're evil, and all relationships should look this particular way. And the fact that a sociopath, sort of by definition, does not engage in relationships in that particular way means that they shouldn't. A sociopath should never be in a relationship. And I think that's kind of an interesting moral assessment that people make.
Well, I'm also wondering, too, if some of these people that you see on forums that are complaining about relationships they had, where they'll say this man or this woman did this, and they caused me to go against all the values I've been raised with, and so forth. And I'm wondering if, in a way, they're projecting or doing transference onto this person, because during the relationship they seem to really enjoy it. But then when the relationship ended, all of a sudden they had to figure out there's got to be a bad guy in here, and so it has to be the person I was with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I find I think you mentioned, maybe we mentioned this in the other show, that I'm Mormon, I'm LDS, and I find this to be true of a lot of people who have strong beliefs that are religious beliefs. People can have all sorts of strong beliefs about what relationships are, mainly as what we're talking about. But when you have those sort of strong beliefs and you violate those strong beliefs, for instance, by doing something like getting a divorce, when the church really frowns on that sort of behavior, you shouldn't be getting a divorce, then there really has to be a bad guy, because they have so much cognitive dissonance. How can I have had this strong belief and then have acted in this way that's so completely different? There must be a bad guy. So I can see that possibly happening with some of the victims. I'm not trying to further victimize them, to the extent I honestly think some of them, really were victims, of emotional or physical or financial abuse. But I do think that there are some also probably who, just as you say, they behaved in a way with that sociopath that they enjoyed at the time, but they later felt shame about. And how do you kind of reconcile those two things? You think, well, the sociopath made me do it. I'm the victim and he is the bad guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've known of situations, especially when it comes to conservative religious people, where I knew one couple that belonged to a really conservative religion, and it was the wife who was always saying that her husband had gotten, this sounds funny, but her husband had gotten her involved had taken her to a nudist colony just for the weekend. Mm. And she really was upset with him during that time period because he didn't want to actually join. She loved it. She wanted to join. She was pestering him to join. A couple of years later, on something totally different, they wound up getting divorced. And later I heard her saying, oh, yeah, he forced me to do these kinds of things. And I'm sitting back thinking, well, wait a minute. I remember when you were really mad at him because he wouldn't actually fork over the money and buy a membership for you, that sort of thing. So I think there's some truth in that.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. But the thing is, ultimately, it seems like again, you're going to find that half the people are going to really enjoy the situation, half the people are going to feel threatened by it, and then you have to see what happens if the relationship maintains. Now, that leads us to a very important question, and that is, can a sociopath or psychopath be someone who will stick with you till the very end? Raise those kids and and be there for you until you're old.
Right. I have that website, Sociopath World, and a lot of people will come on and sort of ask these questions, both sociopaths and often people dating sociopaths, or, sometimes looky-loos, people that are just curious. But we do get a significant portion that are in marriage relationships. They do have kids. They have been married for like 15, 20 years or more. And so I definitely think it's possible. I think that it's not necessarily easy to do. I think that with normal people, let's say, you have enough of sort of core shared values, emotional values, psychological values, maybe even political, or you've both been socialized the same way, to really build on and provide, the foundation for a long-term relationship. I think that if you have a relationship between a sociopath and somebody who's not a sociopath, you don't necessarily have by default those same sorts of values. It might be a little bit something like people from radically different cultures and religions and backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, marrying. And that's kind of, everybody sort of acknowledges that that's difficult to date outside of so many of your shared experiences. If you were to date somebody outside your race, they're a completely different nationality and upbringing, ethnicity, completely different financial background than you. They maybe speak, not your language as their first language. That is very difficult. But I do think that is what a relationship with a sociopath is like. You have to work extra hard to make sure that you are communicating your expectations. And the person has to be willing to allow, each person does, to allow the other person to be who they are at their core. The sociopath can't be, like you're not allowed to feel emotional, or you're not allowed to want emotional intimacy, or you're not allowed to, make these sorts of demands on me. But on the other hand, the other person has to be willing to accept the fact that even if they have these expectations and demands, it may not actually be possible for the sociopath to be emotionally intimate with the person to the extent that they want it. They're not necessarily going to be volunteering to be like the shoulder to cry on, the sympathetic ear, the way that you might experience in a more normal relationship in which both people feel a high degree of empathy. And so we'll kind of just naturally be there for each other. You may have to be a little bit more explicit with a sociopath. Sociopath may turn you down, and that has to be able to work.
Yeah, but in your situation, for instance, and I'm just going to throw hypothetically, you don't have to answer it, but if you were to meet some Mormon guy who has the same educational background, same career aspirations, same family background, aspirations and so forth, wouldn't it be possible then to have a long-term relationship, but just as long as this other person knew that there wasn't going to be that crying on the shoulder, traditional 1950s model of a woman?
Right. Yeah. I definitely think that's possible. I definitely think that's true. I actually think that it's maybe easier for a female sociopath to be in a long-term, well, they both have their strengths. Let me finish with this idea. If you were a female sociopath in a long-term relationship, I feel like in general, at least this is the stereotype, men don't feel like they need as much emotional intimacy in a relationship. So the female sociopath is not going to provide that emotional intimacy, but the male, and this is kind of the sort of traditional heterosexual relationship. Obviously, things would be different in other types of relationships. But the male, in this sense, would not miss it that much because he's not expecting a high degree of emotional intimacy. He's not, every day he needs to come home and have a shoulder to cry on, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe in some ways it would be easier if you were a female sociopath to be in a relationship with somebody who's not sociopathic, who's male. But maybe it's flipped now that I think about it. Maybe because, your normal female, she's so used to dealing with, less emotional male, like this sort of stereotype that husbands are not good listeners, and they're not good shoulders to cry on, and they're fixers. These are the male sorts of personality characteristics are also largely the sociopathic personality characteristics. They're like a little less empathetic. They're not sympathetic. They're a little heartless. They're a little focused on like instrumental aspects of their life. Let's solve a problem rather than let's think and feel on the problem. So maybe a woman is just kind of used to having that because she's never really experienced dating a man who was really kind of highly empathetic anyways. And it's just a matter of degree between a normal male and a male sociopath, perhaps to her. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how that would work out. I mean, I was just wondering what it would be like if two sociopaths got married, or a sociopath and a borderline, or a sociopath and an Asperger. How how those would work. I've actually heard that in relationships, psychopaths and borderlines tend to have like a complementary situation. They
Yeah, that is what I've heard too. And I can see it because borderlines, they're very emotional, right? Again, kind of these are broad strokes. I don't mean to stereotype, but just to focus on the stereotypes for now, for sake of conversation. They're emotional. They don't really have that much control over their emotions. They don't they identify with their emotions in the moment. I am sad and stuff, but part of them later realizes that they're driven by their emotions and they don't like to be driven by their emotions. They would prefer not to have such strong emotions that are constantly impacting their behavior. And I think the sociopath is so unmoved by those sorts of displays of emotional excess that the sociopath does not get triggered and does not escalate the fight when the other person is being emotional. So the emotional outbursts don't have as much destructive effect in the relationship, right? The one is able to emote as much as she wants, and it doesn't really kind of destroy anything. It's like yelling, screaming at the tops of your lungs in a soundproof chamber. You're completely free to do whatever you want in that soundproof chamber. And then the sociopath enjoys the stimulation and excitement, sort of, from the borderline's lack of predictability. She's driven to and fro by her emotions, but that kind of makes it exciting because he can never really tell what she's going to do in the next moment.
Okay, very good. I was glad you confirmed that, because in my book series, the main character has a relationship, well, several relationships. One of them is with this other female character who is borderline, and they complement each other extremely well, and so forth. So it seems like maybe those, not so much opposites attract, but maybe the borderline finds a certain security in the fact that this person doesn't run away immediately.
Right.
Yeah. But also the borderline seems that they share certain characteristics with the psychopath, in the sense that at least a female borderline is someone who tends not to have a fixed sense of, well, sexual identity. Therefore, they also like novelty and breaking the norms.
Right. Yeah, they don't have a fixed sense of kind of identity at all about a lot of things. I find there to be a similar sort of symbiotic relationship between people who are very, very empathetic with sociopaths. Because similarly, they're used to constantly feeling the emotions of other people around them, that to be around a sociopath, it's actually a relief that the sociopathic person is so low, emotionally speaking, because it's like they don't have to, constantly be affected by the sociopath's emotions like they are a normal person. And the highly empathetic person is able to empathize, actually, with even the sociopath's unique worldview. And so the highly empathetic person is able to understand the sociopath in a way that the sociopath, there aren't many people that do understand and sort of accept sociopaths on that level. So I think that's also a very complementary relationship.
Okay, yeah, okay. So those kinds of, the thing is, I've always seen that these so-called personality disorders have a positive and a negative. It just depends on how they're mixed in.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. You take a look at the highly empathetic. Everybody thinks empathy is so great, but it is kind of terrible to be so highly empathetic. It's possible for you to be so highly empathetic that you're just paralyzed with all the emotions that you're constantly being exposed to, and that doesn't sound like a good thing.
No. Hey, I'm going to get into children here in a second, but I was talking to a woman recently who, she was going to go in for insemination. And it wasn't because she was single, it was because her husband couldn't, he couldn't have kids. There must have been some cancer or something. And the funny thing is, she knew that I was interested in these topics, so she actually said, I wonder if there's any way you could request a donor who was psychopathic. And I asked her why, and she said, well, they seem to have these kind of traits that are designed for today's society. I mean, to get ahead. And
right.
And What do you think? Do you think actually having these traits today for a child, of course, it's going to be problems for the child, but has it been easier for you to compete in today's society with a sociopathic personality background?
I definitely think so. And I think that every time I'm a lawyer, I think that every time I engage in some like typical, very high conflict situation, somebody's screaming at me, I'm, in court trying to argue this very difficult to make argument in front of people who are, very judgmental and are going to be critical of what I'm about to say. And I just think, other aspects too, like we live in a highly superficial society. We have a situation where teenagers and even younger children are being bullied and harassed online and, basically driven to suicide because they're made to feel these feelings of shame and low self-worth. And these are situations that would never happen to a sociopathic child. A sociopath would never be bullied. He would never be sad about these particular things, never kind of be driven to feelings of low self-worth or even suicide. And so I do think, yeah, they're very resilient that way. It's a little bit like they're like a weed, in a garden full of delicate tulips or something. And they're very hardy and they're very they welcome change. They have a very easy time sort of adapting to new situations. So I think that there are a lot of competitive advantages to being a sociopath. I think what would be the ideal situation is, maybe in 30 years, what's happened with gay rights and our acceptance of that, particular different strain of humanity, our acceptance and ability to allow people to be authentically themselves in that way. Maybe that will happen for sociopaths as well. Then it really would be an incredible advantage, I think, to be a sociopath. If you could both have those sort of strategic advantages of the sociopathic personality without the problems of being kind of this persecuted or, child growing up as a sociopath without a lot of guidance or without a lot of understanding from the people around you. And, that can go wrong. If you have the wrong parents and you're a sociopath child, that can go very wrong. If you have the right parents, then it can go very right. So I think that that's kind of the danger now, but maybe in 30 years, that will improve for sociopathic children.
Don't you think, though, that I got to take issue with one thing, and that
Right,
is
go ahead.
I think at least I've read that, at least with boys, that often psychopathic children, young boys, because at first they realize there's something different about them, that they don't fit in so well when they're young and actually can be bullied, but they're the ones who usually will turn the tables and learn how to gain strength. Even though they might have been pushed around when they were younger, they'll be the ones who will learn to either use their verbal skills or develop their physical skills later so that it doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah, I should have clarified more. They're not necessarily victims of bullying to the extent that it like affects them in these sort of negative ways. It's possible that they are exposed to bullies, that they are the target of bullying, but they're not the classic victims the way that we generally think of in these bullying situations.
No, they'll get revenge.
Right, exactly.
So, now, saying that, what do you think about the parent? I mean, obviously, a lot of kids, if you ask a kid that's 12 years old, they're going to be like, well, yeah, my parents are psychopaths. Obviously that's only true in a small percentage of situations. But how would the psychopathic mother relate to her children in a different way than a regular person would relate to her children?
Well, I think that again, I can't speak from experience. I don't have children, but I am around children a lot. I have a lot of nieces and nephews and little cousins that are children. And I feel like the way that I treat them is as if they're little adults, you know. So you don't get the same, like a sociopath is not going to baby talk to a child no matter how young, you know. It's like it's everybody is kind of like an adult. Everybody gets spoken to on the same sort of level, which is not to say that the substance of the conversation would be adult substance. You know, you're not going to talk to the child about, you know, Zimbabwe's inflation crisis or something, but you aren't kind of, you know, whatever impulse it is to baby talk to children or to kind of talk down to them, or to kind of shield them from the world. I think it almost is. You know, I feel no obligation or even inclination to shield them. If I were to play chess with a child, or if I were to play, you know, soccer or even tackle football, I would still play as if I were playing with normal people, normal adults. You know, there's not a desire to sugarcoat anything for them. So I think that that is probably a major difference in the way that I treat children versus other people treat children. You know, and some people, you know, you can see that there are advantages and disadvantages to both ways of treating children. The one children, you know, I have a sister who kind of acts like that with her children, and her children are very, very independent. They're still young, but they'll do whatever they want, and they feel completely capable of doing anything they want. And, you know, it's like we're packing up to leave for a weekend. You know, I could be babysitting them, and like even the 5-year-old is packing her own bag and is remembering her toothbrush, and they're just very capable individuals. On the other hand, you know, there is a lot of ugliness in the world, and maybe it really does scar children to be exposed to the sorts of stresses and ugliness that adults kind of get exposed to and other people kind of shield their children from. You know, I think of this, I heard this very interesting story actually in Sunday school a few weeks ago. This woman who was converted to Mormonism, and when she was like 5 or something, her mom converted really, and then she started going to church with the mom. And she went to a party, a pool party, with a bunch of other Mormon girls, and she was wearing a bikini. It wasn't, you know, like a crazy, you know, ridiculous string bikini or something, but it was a two-piece. And in Mormon culture, you know, the girls wear one-piece swimming suits. That's kind of like a very culturally enforced thing. And so the girls at the party were making fun of this little girl who's like a new convert, you know, doesn't know anything about Mormonism. She said she went in the bathroom, you know, because they were making fun of her, and she tried to kind of figure out what to do. And she said, I didn't feel shame. I just felt confusion. You know, why is this such a big deal? Why is this considered wrong? Why are people making such a big deal about this? And then she finally figures it out, and she thinks, okay, you know, I'll just put a shirt on. I'll wear a shirt in the pool, and that way nobody will have a problem anymore. They won't be able to see any of my midriff, and so there won't be any issue. But I thought that was such an interesting way to kind of put it. And I feel like that is a very, afterwards, she goes with the mom. The mom notices, hey, you're wearing that wet shirt. And what happened? And she explains, and the mom kind of just gets quiet, and she just says, you know, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was one of the rules. You know, I guess the missionaries didn't tell me, or, you know, I wouldn't have done that to you. I wouldn't have let you been exposed to that sort of judgment. And I thought, actually, how hearing this story, it's a very normal story, but it does kind of speak to my sociopathic experience too, in that there are all these kind of hidden rules. And I think that as a sociopathic parent, that you might do that to a child, sort of expose them to judgment for something that they're doing that's not really considered socially acceptable. And you're just not even aware that that is like something that the child is going to be judged for, because you yourself are not a conformist. You know, you're not keeping track of that carefully, your own self. So I think that would be another interesting aspect of having a sociopathic parent, is their obliviousness to social norms and to the sorts of moral rules that everybody else adheres to. It would make you a very kind of open-minded, kind of free-thinking child, which has its advantages. But I think it would be difficult in terms of you being normal, the way that most everybody is normal in this kind of sheep conformist sort of way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. I understand it, but of course, if the child was sociopathic, they wouldn't even be bothered so much. But
right.
they might be like trying to analyze the situation and try to understand it. But
well, I also thought her reaction was very interesting that way too. She said, I wasn't shamed by it. I was just confused. And I also think that's a very sociopathic child reaction about stuff. Like, how do you learn if you yourself don't have like a sense of social norms that they should be enforced, and that we should all conform, or of morality? How do you learn those sorts of things? You are in those situations. Everybody's making fun of you for this particular thing, and you're not shamed by it. You're just confused. You just don't understand, like, why is this such a big deal? But then you just adapt to it. And that's how a sociopath learns to wear his or her mask. A sociopath child is they're just exposed to, thousands, tens of thousands of those little situations. They just learn all of these little rules that everybody else seems to just intuit.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting indeed. Hey, we're out of time, but tell people how they can get access to information about your book and also your website.
So the website has probably most of the information about the book that you'd need. It's sociopathworld.com. The book is sold on Amazon. It's translated into, I don't know, half dozen or so different languages. And it's Confessions of a Sociopath, a Life Spent Hiding in Plain Sight.
All right. Well, great. It's been really great conversation tonight. Very, very, very nice. Thank you very much for sharing with our audience this really
Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah. Well, anyway, we'll have a great weekend. And maybe we'll have you back on in a few more months and, follow up with some other information.
Sounds great. It would be my pleasure.
Okay. Well, take care. And also thank you, listening audience, for tuning in to our show here this evening. Bye now.
And on top of that, I am concerned about this report about Syrian rebels and the ceasefire with ISIS. Senator
but
Paul,
that's not true.
Well,
it's not true.
It's not true.
Whether I don't care about the report. I know these people intimately. We talk to them all the time. But also let me point out that if we are going to conduct a conflict the way you are describing it, and I'm afraid that's the case, this is reminiscent of Vietnam, the gradual escalation that ended up in one of the worst defeats that America has ever suffered.
Let me ask you about what your colleague Rand Paul said about it this morning. He said it's a mistake to arm them. Most of the arms that we've given the so-called moderate rebels have wound up in the hands of ISIS because ISIS simply takes it from them, or it is given to them, and we mistakenly actually end up giving it to some radicals. Look, things are very...
Has Rand Paul ever been to Syria? Has he ever met with ISIS? Has he ever met with any of these people? No. We're going to have a fight because it's patently false. This is the same Rand Paul that said we didn't want to have anything to do with anything to do in the Middle East, by the way. I don't want to get in a fight with him at all. Yeah. But it's not true. I know these people. I'm in contact with them all the time.
All right, let me ask you this.
In a Quinnipiac University national poll, a plurality of voters say President Barack Obama is the worst president since World War II. 33% of voters think the current president is the worst since 1945.
For more news, visit pigmindnews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.